Sure, you've got all this strategy and doctrine, but if you were there, if you were one of those boys made to go over the top, well then you'd feel differently, and you wouldn't be so quick to defend those evil generals. Okay, and? I've seen arguments like this quite a few times now. It crops up whenever I discuss the means of warfare, and most particularly the First World War. There's an idea, after all, that World War I was a useless conflict that saw millions of lives thrown away through sheer stupidity and arrogance, the lions led by donkeys narrative that is simply false. But of course, arguing the nuances of a highly precise military doctrine is far more difficult than spouting off conspiracy theories and tired old tropes, which is what makes them so difficult to depose. Explaining the reasons why an infantry advance might take place under artillery that's so danger close that a little friendly fire is quite literally baked into the equation, for example, that's a lot harder than just saying, oh, well, they fired on their own men because they were evil and they were stupid. Military history is complex, especially that of the First World War. Its doctrines and strategies, by virtue of the technology and the means by which that war was fought, they might at first glance seem like total madness. But with a deeper understanding of the material circumstances that led to those means and dictated the myriad limitations which armies were facing in 1914, well then you begin to see that there was always a reason behind the way they fought. Sometimes those reasons were good and ultimately correct. Other times, less so. But they were very rarely, not never, mind you, just very rarely, ever this simplistic narrative of donkeys making all the calls, especially in the Allied forces. Now, alongside the difficulty of understanding and explaining properly all of these material concerns that are at play here, there's also the question of the nature of warfare itself, which is so inherently cruel. The First World War was a total war. It was a war of countless millions, a war for the survival of entire states and of global empires. No part of the world was untouched by it, and as cruel and as heartless and evil as it sounds, there are 3 more adjectives that I look forward to people using to describe me, in that context, individual lives, while they're obviously important, are by no means all important. Now, it may sound like a 40K quote or something, but in that kind of setting, not just the labor or the bodies of a population, but in fact their very lives become a currency that is used by the state apparatus, by the military, however you want to call it, right? It's used as a currency to achieve objectives. For example, a commanding officer might have the task to take a hill, right, or anything like that. Now, emotionally, obviously he's going to want to preserve as many of his men's lives as possible, but ultimately he can only do so within the context of his greater duty to take that enemy position. And that task is something which will invariably cost lives. Now, it would be fantastic if he could take the hill without anyone dying. It would be swell if we could just end the whole war without any violence at all. The Germans could just waltz on back over into Germany and we can all play nice. But that isn't on the table. It's just well-wishing, and in war, it's useless, especially when you are being actively invaded. You don't really have a choice in the matter. Of course, the officer in this case can take steps to try and limit the number of lives that he will invariably lose, precisely as most of the nations and armies of the war were doing, through new technologies, new strategies and tactics, all these different things. They spent significant efforts trying to come up with better doctrines. The beginning of the First World War, and especially the Western Front, looked almost nothing like its middle, which looked almost nothing like its end. But trying to reinvent the wheel and upend thousands of years, in this case, of military understanding is not an easy task. It takes time, and through that time, it costs lives. Now again, I have multiple videos all about some of these various strategies that, again, look like madness on the outside, but which really have very important reasons behind them all for better or for worse, whether they ended up working or not. But the point is that sometimes, indeed oftentimes really, warfare demands sacrifice. It is, after all, at its very core, it's a form of organized mass killing. So returning to our example, that officer needs to take the hill. He calculates how he's going to do so using all of the means available to him. His technology, his resources, his manpower, everything. And through it all, to the best of his ability, he comes up with a plan that is going to limit the number of casualties as much as possible, but which invariably will still result in at least a few casualties, potentially, he hopes not, but potentially even deaths. All the same, despite the fact that there is a possibility of death, he still has to proceed, right? That can't be an element that cancels out the whole thing. You know, if you're building a bridge and you come up with a plan to build the bridge in civilian life, and it's like, oh wait, if we do this, one of our construction workers is going to be in a really dangerous place. He could die. Obviously, go back to the drawing board, rewrite the blueprints, do whatever you have to do. But in war, just because someone died, that's kind of part of how it all works, right? The alternative, then, to not follow the orders, leave the enemy untouched, and allow them to continue with their own plans, just as an example, say, for example, they're shelling your position from a vantage point, well, whatever it is, that could ultimately cost even more lives over time. Again, you know, the purpose of building a bridge is building the bridge, is commerce and traffic and whatnot. The purpose of war is to achieve objectives through violence. You can't avoid the violence, you can't avoid suffering the violence in the pursuit of war. Now, going into battle, knowing that some of your men, as a direct result of your decisions, will die, or at the very least be horribly mutilated, that's a horrible thing, I'm sure. But it doesn't suddenly change the arithmetic. The hill still needs to be taken. The enemy still needs to be fought, because the alternative is most likely much worse. And if the alternative isn't worse, that's because we haven't figured that out yet. We don't know that it's not worse, because, in this case, so much of the First World War is so novel. So on this idea that I would feel differently if I was there, well, you know what? Yeah, I imagine that I would. And if I felt like there was a really strong chance that I would die because, you know, some missions are inherently more dangerous and deadly than others, and some doctrines will, again, as an example, have a necessary quantity of friendly fire because of how they're functioning, especially in historical conflict, well, you know, if through all of that, I didn't feel like I even had a choice in the matter, of course I would be upset by it. I would be thinking of my loved ones back home. I might even be trying to think of a way to get out of it all. And I would certainly be looking for someone to blame. And you know what? That blame probably gonna fall on the guy who's telling me, hey, you're the lucky one. You're gonna have to be the one that goes out and probably dies, so that all the rest of us can achieve this esoteric objective, right? Whether that's by, you know, having to run out and suppress the enemy or throw the grenade into the bunker, whatever it is. You're gonna be in the risky position, you're probably gonna die, but your sacrifice is gonna allow all the rest of us to do the thing we have to do. I might not see the overarching strategic value of it all, nor would I necessarily care, because I wouldn't even be around to see it, right? I would be terrified at the prospect. And if these videos that I make about doctrine and the like were all about how those brave Allied soldiers were so proud and happy to die by their own shells falling danger close and whatnot, well then, you know what? Yeah, that would be a really important point to make, that I would feel differently if I was there. But that's not the point of those videos. That isn't what I'm ever saying. Just because I personally would suddenly be impacted negatively by this matter doesn't suddenly invalidate the matter. It doesn't mean that the strategy is without merit, even if all of the merit in my individual eyes had gone. The point is the overall strategy, the whole of the war effort, the whole of the national effort within which these individuals are playing only one small part. Not the single life, but the life of the unit, the life of the army, the life of the nation, because that is what's all at risk. It is sad, it is hellish, and it is warped, and it is necessary should the war prove a success. That is military history. It's horrifying, it's a tragic thing, but that doesn't mean it wasn't sometimes necessary. Now, it is vitally important that we understand the individuals within said history. We understand their emotions, their experiences, and what they can teach us. But it is also important to contextualize them and to understand that individual perspectives are not perfect. They're only single threads of a much wider tapestry. Think about it in terms of the trolley problem. The way I see it, the only correct answer to that particular moral quandary is to pull the lever, to sacrifice one and save the many. In such a scenario, there is no such thing as inaction, for our every waking moment is an active choice. So too is one's existence within a state of total war, always a part of a wider collective effort. Total war is a phrase often spoken, but little understood. Now, if I were on the trolley tracks myself, right? Well, obviously I can pontificate here from the comfort of my home about how I would understand the need to die so that the numerous others may live, and that is really the glory of sacrifice, and blah, 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 blah. Obviously I can do that sort of thing, but that kind of theorizing is largely useless until I'm actually in the spot, right? Because when push comes to shove, while I may, do the right thing and be noble and urge the person to pull the lever, I might also start thinking about my family. I might start thinking about my work and my dreams and how really my life is quite important. I mean, look at those other 5. Are they really so important as I am? Maybe it would be better if he didn't pull the lever, and so on and so on. Because, again, it would be my life on the line. So while I can say, well, clearly I believe that the lever should be pulled, if I was in that position, I would feel differently. I might not be strong enough to still want the right thing to be done to have me get plowed over by a trolley instead of the 5 or 10 or whatever people. And of course, I should hope that I will never be placed in so painful a position as to need to figure out whether I've got the guts or not to do the right thing. I hope that my decisions to do the right things in life will always be easy. But the point is that none of this suddenly means, right, if I feel differently in the spot, it doesn't mean that the decision to save me at the expense of the numerous others would ever be the correct one. The arithmetic, in this case, has become more emotionally charged, but it hasn't changed. The First World War has a lot of emotion built up around it. It was a deeply consequential war of nationalistic origins and whose morality is not quite so clear-cut as the Second War was. And because of that emotion, people get upset whenever we talk about it. We especially get upset when our narratives around the war are questioned, and particularly so when those narratives run parallel to our wider worldviews and our political beliefs. Boy, oh boy, are the narratives of the First World War abused for political purposes all the time, ranging from the classic stabbed-in-the-back style myths to the unfortunately quite common idea that it was just some ploy by the industrial elite to kill off all the poor upon which their wealth relied, which doesn't really make any sense at all, but hey, that is a topic for another day. The point is this, is that all of this myth-making and world-building around these material concerns in military history make it difficult to speak about without people getting really emotionally involved. It makes it to where I can't talk about how mobilization timetables work without people accusing me of being an evil war hawk, accurate though that description may be. Of course, true objectivity, right, being fully detached, is impossible. We all have our biases, but it's important that we always strive to be closer to that objectivity. Overall, then, The point is this, is that sometimes what is good for the larger body is not what is good for us individually. And that is especially the case in warfare, and that's what makes it so important that when we read military history, we not allow our emotions to run away from us. Now, don't get me wrong. We need to understand that emotion. We need to do our best to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to understand their perspectives, their struggles, their suffering. These are vital elements to understanding history, especially military history, that are all too often neglected or even outright forgotten. But neither must we allow these individual elements to totally dominate the wider historical narrative, because they aren't the whole story. You know, I often say that I don't care so much about the rifle as I do the soldier who's carrying it. And I say that as a way to drive home the importance of the individual stories in warfare, which often feels so neglected in comparison to its more technical details, like, the caliber of a gun or something. But that doesn't mean, if I'm focusing on the individual story, it doesn't mean that I can neglect the rifle and the caliber and whatnot, because those material concerns are those around which the man's story is revolving. For without understanding that wider context within which the soldier is operating, well then what use is his narrative to me beyond representing a little blink of emotion in an endless sea of seemingly senseless suffering? So, would I feel differently about the means by which the First World War were fought, or any war for that matter, if I were actually there? Yeah, you know what? I might. But just because I would feel something doesn't make it true. And that is what makes this argument against my discussions of military doctrine so very silly. So with all of that, thank you for watching, and until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.